June 12, 1944. The summer heat pressed down on Camp Alva, Oklahoma, as Wehrmacht Sergeant Klaus Mueller stepped off the transport truck, his mud-caked boots hitting American soil for the first time. The irony wasn't lost on him. 6 months earlier, he had been firing artillery shells at Allied positions in Italy, and now he stood behind barbed wire, a prisoner of the very nation he had been trained to destroy. Mueller's pale blue eyes swept across the sprawling compound that would become his home for an indeterminate future. Wooden barracks stretched in orderly rows, surrounded by guard towers manned by young American soldiers who seemed barely old enough to shave. The facility housed nearly 3,000 German prisoners of war, making it one of the largest such installations in the American Midwest. What struck Mueller immediately wasn't the harsh treatment he had expected. The Geneva Convention guidelines were being followed meticulously, but rather the almost casual atmosphere that pervaded the camp. American guards chatted with prisoners in broken German, cigarettes were distributed freely, and the food, while not luxurious, was far superior to the rations he had survived on during the final months of the Italian campaign. Lieutenant Colonel James Richardson, the camp's commanding officer, had implemented what military historians would later recognize as a revolutionary approach to prisoner management. Rather than viewing the German captives as enemies to be contained and punished, Richardson saw them as human beings who needed to be re-educated about democratic values and prepared for eventual reintegration into post-war society. The first indication that Camp Alva operated differently from Mueller's expectations came during his second week of imprisonment. A loudspeaker crackled to life in the evening, announcing that a film would be shown in the camp's recreation hall. Mueller exchanged puzzled glances with his fellow prisoners. Entertainment had been a foreign concept during their military service, where every moment was dedicated to warfare or survival. As reported in the Oklahoma City Times archives from this period, American POW camps were conducting unprecedented experiments in cultural exchange through cinema. The camp's recreation hall, a converted mess facility, had been equipped with a 16mm projector and a makeshift screen fashioned from white canvas. Wooden benches arranged in rows could accommodate nearly 200 prisoners at a time. That first evening, as Mueller filed into the dimly lit hall alongside hundreds of his compatriots, he had no conception of how profoundly this experience would alter his worldview. The prisoners settled onto the hard wooden benches, their conversations gradually dying to whispers as the projector began to whir. Many had never seen a motion picture before. Cinema had been largely forbidden or heavily censored under Nazi rule, particularly American productions. The opening credits of Casablanca flickered across the canvas screen, and Mueller felt his breath catch in his throat. Here was Humphrey Bogart, the quintessential American actor, playing Rick Blaine with a complexity and moral ambiguity that German propaganda had insisted was impossible in American culture. The sophisticated dialogue, the nuanced character development, and the film's anti-Nazi themes created a cognitive dissonance that left Mueller and his fellow prisoners stunned into silence. As Ingrid Bergman's Ilsa pleaded with Bogart's Rick to help her and her resistance fighter husband escape Casablanca, Mueller realized he was witnessing something that challenged every assumption he had held about American society and culture. June 19, 1944. Private Hans Zimmermann pressed his face closer to the mesh window of Barracks 12, watching American soldiers unload wooden crates from a military truck. The stenciled letters MGM and Warner Brothers were clearly visible on the containers, and word had spread throughout Camp Alva that another film screening was scheduled for that evening. Zimmermann, barely 21 years old, had been captured during the Battle of Monte Battaglia, his first and last major engagement. Unlike the seasoned veterans like Sergeant Mueller, Zimmermann had grown up entirely under Nazi rule, his adolescence shaped by Hitler Youth propaganda, and carefully curated information about the outside world. American cinema had been portrayed as crude, morally corrupt entertainment designed to weaken the Aryan spirit. The previous week's screening of Casablanca had left him profoundly unsettled. The film's sophisticated narrative, its complex moral questions, and its portrayal of resistance against fascism had contradicted everything he had been taught about American cultural inferiority. Now, as he watched the steady delivery of Hollywood productions to the camp, Zimmerman began to suspect that his education had been incomplete. Captain Robert Hayes, the camp's morale officer, had carefully selected each film with specific educational objectives in mind. According to declassified War Department documents from this period, the military had developed a comprehensive program designed to expose German prisoners to American democratic values through popular entertainment. The strategy was both subtle and revolutionary. Rather than lecturing prisoners about freedom and democracy, the films would demonstrate these concepts through compelling narratives. That evening's selection was Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, Frank Capra's 1939 masterpiece about political corruption and individual conscience. As the prisoners filed into the recreation hall, their conversations buzzed with anticipation and skepticism in equal measure. Many had dismissed the previous film as an anomaly, convinced that American cinema couldn't consistently produce such sophisticated entertainment. James Stewart's portrayal of Jefferson Smith, the idealistic young senator fighting against political corruption, captivated the German audience in ways that surprised even the American camp officials. The film's central theme, that individual integrity could triumph over institutional corruption, resonated powerfully with prisoners who had lived under an authoritarian system where questioning authority meant death. Corporal Friedrich Weber, a former Hitler youth leader from Munich, found himself unexpectedly moved by Stewart's filibuster scene. Weber had been trained to believe that American democracy was a facade hiding Jewish capitalist manipulation, yet here was a film that openly criticized the very system it emerged from. The freedom to produce such criticism, to distribute it widely, and to celebrate it as entertainment suggested a society far more open and self-reflective than Nazi propaganda had indicated. During the film's intermission, heated discussions erupted throughout the hall. Veterans like Muller found themselves defending their evolving understanding of American culture to younger prisoners who clung desperately to their ideological training. The conversations revealed deep fractures within the prisoner community, generational divides between older soldiers who remembered pre-Nazi Germany and younger men who had never known any other system. As referenced in the International Red Cross reports from Camp Alva during this period, the film screenings had become the most anticipated events in the prisoners' weekly routine. Men who had once spent their evenings writing letters home or playing chess now gathered hours before showtime, discussing previous films and speculating about upcoming selections. The psychological impact of these screenings extended far beyond simple entertainment. For many prisoners, Hollywood films represented their first exposure to uncensored information about the outside world. They witnessed American actors portraying complex, flawed characters who struggled with moral dilemmas, a stark contrast to the heroic archetypes promoted by Nazi cinema. July 4, 1944. The irony was palpable as 3,000 German prisoners of war celebrated American Independence Day by watching The Great Dictator, Charlie Chaplin's devastating satire of Adolf Hitler. Sergeant Klaus Mueller sat transfixed as Chaplin's adenoid Hinkle, a thinly veiled caricature of the Führer, goose-stepped across the screen in a performance so accurate it was painful. Miller had served in the Wehrmacht since 1939, witnessing firsthand the gradual transformation of German society under Nazi rule. He remembered the book burnings, the increasing restrictions on free expression, and the systematic elimination of dissenting voices. Yet here, in an American prisoner of war camp, he was watching a film that mocked his former supreme commander with impunity. The camp's commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Richardson, had chosen this particular film for Independence Day with deliberate intent. According to War Department correspondence archived at the National Archives, Richardson believed that humor could penetrate ideological barriers more effectively than direct propaganda. Chaplin's masterpiece demonstrated the power of satirical commentary in a free society while simultaneously revealing the absurdity of totalitarian leadership. Private Otto Brenner, a 23-year-old tank operator from the Afrika Korps, found himself laughing despite his initial discomfort. Brenner had idolized Hitler since childhood, viewing the Nazi leader as Germany's savior from economic chaos and international humiliation. Watching Chaplin's Hinkle stumble through increasingly ridiculous scenarios while demanding absolute obedience forced Brenner to confront uncomfortable questions about the nature of authority and worship. The film's climactic speech, delivered by Chaplin's Jewish barber who had been mistaken for the dictator, left the prison audience in stunned silence. The barber's passionate plea for humanity, tolerance, and freedom directly contradicted everything these German soldiers had been taught about Jewish influence and democratic weakness. As Chaplin's character spoke of machine men with machine minds, many prisoners recognized uncomfortable parallels to their own recent experiences in the Wehrmacht. Technical Sergeant Wilhelm Hoffmann, a veteran of the Eastern Front, experienced what he would later describe as a moment of profound clarity during the film. Hoffmann had participated in operations that, while militarily justified in his mind, had resulted in civilian casualties and cultural destruction. The film's message about the humanity that connects all people regardless of nationality or religion challenged his carefully constructed justifications for wartime actions. The camp's German-speaking psychiatrist, Major David Goldstein, himself a Jewish refugee who had fled Nazi Germany in 1936, observed the prisoners' reactions with professional fascination. According to his classified reports from this period, the film screenings were producing measurable psychological changes in the prisoner population. Men who had arrived at Camp Alva as committed Nazis were beginning to express doubts about their former beliefs. Following the screening, the prison camp experienced what guards described as an unusual period of reflection. Normally boisterous prisoners sat quietly in small groups, engaging in intense conversations about the film's themes. Several requested meetings with camp chaplains to discuss questions of morality and personal responsibility that the movie had raised. The American Red Cross representative visiting Camp Alva during this period, Mrs. Eleanor Patterson, documented the remarkable transformation occurring within the prisoner population. In her report to the International Committee, Patterson noted that many German POWs were expressing genuine curiosity about American democratic institutions and requesting additional educational materials about constitutional government. However, not all prisoners welcomed this cinematic education. A minority led by former SS officers and committed Nazi Party members organized informal resistance to what they termed American propaganda efforts. These men encouraged their fellow prisoners to boycott film screenings and maintain loyalty to National Socialist principles, despite their current circumstances. The ideological divisions within the prisoner community became increasingly pronounced as the Hollywood film program continued. Younger prisoners, particularly those with limited combat experience, proved more susceptible to the democratic messages embedded in American cinema. July 26, 1944. Corporal Heinz Schultz had never imagined that a Western film could fundamentally challenge his understanding of justice and heroism. As Stagecoach unfolded on the makeshift screen in Camp Alva's recreation hall, Schultz found himself reconsidering concepts he thought were immutable. John Wayne's Ringo Kid embodied a type of individualistic heroism that Nazi ideology had systematically discouraged. The notion that a single person could stand against social prejudice and institutional corruption. Schultz had grown up in Bavaria, where community solidarity and obedience to authority were considered the highest virtues. The Nazi Party had reinforced these cultural tendencies, emphasizing collective identity over individual conscience. Yet here was an American film celebrating a character who defied social conventions to protect the innocent and pursue personal justice. The impact of John Ford's masterpiece extended beyond individual character development. The film's diverse cast of characters, a prostitute with a heart of gold, a drunken doctor who redeems himself, a corrupt banker fleeing with stolen money, presented moral complexity that German prisoners had rarely encountered in their heavily censored entertainment options. Major Richard Thompson, the camp's intelligence officer, had been monitoring prisoner conversations following film screenings with increasing interest. According to his confidential reports to the War Department, archived at the Military History Institute, the Hollywood film program was achieving remarkable success in breaking down Nazi ideological conditioning. Prisoners were beginning to question fundamental assumptions about American society, Jewish influence, and democratic governance. The screening of Stagecoach coincided with significant developments in the European theater of war. News of the failed July 20th assassination attempt against Hitler had reached Camp Alva through official channels, creating additional psychological pressure on prisoners who were already questioning their former loyalties. The film's themes of moral courage and individual responsibility resonated powerfully with men grappling with questions about their own complicity in Nazi war crimes. Private Johann Krause, a former member of the Hitler Youth leadership, experienced what he later described as an awakening during the film's climactic scenes. Krause had been indoctrinated from childhood to believe that individual desires must always be subordinated to collective needs, as defined by party leadership. Watching John Wayne's character risk everything to protect strangers challenged these fundamental assumptions about personal responsibility and moral duty. The prisoner discussions following Stagecoach revealed deep philosophical divisions within the camp community. Veterans like Sergeant Muller, who had retained some memory of pre-Nazi German culture, found themselves defending increasingly democratic viewpoints against younger prisoners who struggled to abandon their ideological training. Captain Hayes, the morale officer responsible for film selection, had carefully planned a progression from explicitly anti-Nazi films like The Great Dictator to more subtly influential works that demonstrated American values without direct political messaging. According to his personal correspondence with War Department officials, Hayes believed that entertainment could accomplish what formal education programs could not: genuine psychological transformation. The success of the film program hadn't gone unnoticed by camp authorities at other installations. Military intelligence reports from this period indicate that similar programs were being implemented at prisoner of war camps throughout the United States, with varying degrees of success depending on local conditions and prisoner populations. However, the Hollywood screenings also created unexpected challenges for camp administration. A significant minority of prisoners, particularly those with strong Nazi Party affiliations, organized boycotts of film screenings and attempted to intimidate fellow prisoners who participated enthusiastically in the program. These internal conflicts sometimes erupted into physical confrontations that required intervention by American guards. The psychological transformation occurring at Camp Alva reflected broader questions about post-war reconstruction and the possibility of genuine denazification. If German prisoners could be influenced by American popular culture, what did this suggest about the potential for democratic transformation in occupied Germany? August 15, 1944, the arrival of It's a Wonderful Life at Camp Alva created an unexpected emotional crisis among the German prisoner population. Frank Capra's exploration of individual worth and community responsibility struck directly at the heart of Nazi ideology's collectivist messaging, but from an entirely different angle than previous films had attempted. Sergeant Klaus Miller found himself deeply unsettled by James Stewart's portrayal of George Bailey, a man whose individual choices had profound impacts on his entire community. Under Nazi doctrine, Muller had been taught that individual sacrifice for the state was the highest virtue, but Bailey's story suggested that individual goodness could create positive change through personal relationships and moral choices rather than political action. The film's central premise, that every person's life touches countless others in meaningful ways, contradicted the Nazi classification of human beings into superior and inferior categories. For prisoners who had participated in or witnessed the systematic dehumanization of entire populations, Bailey's revelation that all lives have inherent value created uncomfortable but necessary psychological confrontations. Private Ernst Weber, captured during the Normandy retreat, had never seen such an emotionally complex portrayal of masculinity. Nazi culture celebrated stoic warriors who suppressed emotional vulnerability in favor of martial strength. Stewart's George Bailey cried, expressed fear, contemplated suicide, and ultimately found redemption through acknowledging his dependence on others, behaviors that would have been considered weakness in Wehrmacht culture. The camp's psychological evaluation reports, compiled by Major Goldstein and recently declassified, revealed that "It's a Wonderful Life" had a more profound impact on prisoner attitudes than any previous film screening. Men who had maintained rigid Nazi beliefs through months of captivity began requesting individual counseling sessions to discuss the moral questions raised by Bailey's story. Technical Sergeant Rudolf Zimmermann, a veteran of the Siege of Leningrad, experienced what he later described as a complete breakdown of his worldview during the film's climactic scenes. Zimmermann had participated in actions that resulted in civilian starvation and death, justifying these atrocities as necessary sacrifices for German victory. Bailey's realization that preventing harm to others was more important than personal success challenged Zimmermann's carefully constructed psychological defenses. The film screening coincided with increasingly positive news from the Western Front for Allied forces. American guards reported that prisoner morale was undergoing a complex transformation. While military defeat became increasingly certain, many German POWs seemed to be discovering hope for personal redemption through exposure to American cultural values. Lieutenant Colonel Richardson recognized that the film program had evolved beyond simple entertainment or propaganda into something approaching genuine psychological rehabilitation. His correspondence with War Department officials during this period reveals growing confidence that significant numbers of German prisoners were experiencing authentic ideological conversion. However, the success of the Hollywood program also intensified resistance from committed Nazi prisoners. Former SS officers organized clandestine meetings to counter what they termed Jewish-American psychological warfare. These resistance efforts included threats against prisoners who participated enthusiastically in film screenings and attempts to maintain Nazi Party discipline within the camp structure. The ideological battle within Camp Alva reflected broader questions about human nature and the possibility of genuine political conversion. Could exposure to democratic values through popular entertainment actually transform individuals who had been systematically indoctrinated in totalitarian ideology? The evidence from Camp Alva suggested that the answer was cautiously optimistic. According to International Red Cross reports from this period, camp authorities were documenting unprecedented levels of prisoner cooperation with educational programs and increasing requests for information about American democratic institutions. Many German POWs expressed interest in remaining in the United States after the war's conclusion rather than returning to what they anticipated would be a devastated homeland. September 8, 1944. The screening of 12 Angry Men at Camp Alva produced the most intense discussions yet witnessed among the German prisoner population. Sidney Lumet's masterpiece about jury deliberation and the presumption of innocence represented concepts entirely foreign to men who had lived under a legal system where guilt was predetermined and trials were merely theatrical performances. Corporal Friedrich Weber sat transfixed as Henry Fonda's Juror 8 methodically dismantled prejudicial assumptions to protect an innocent defendant. Weber had served as a military police officer in occupied France, where he had participated in summary executions based on nothing more than suspicious associations or ethnic background. The film's insistence that doubt was preferable to wrongful conviction challenged every assumption Weber had held about justice and legal procedure. The concept of presumed innocence particularly troubled younger prisoners who had been raised entirely under Nazi rule. Private Hans Dietrich, captured during the Battle of the Bulge, had never encountered a legal system where the accused possessed rights or where accusers bore the burden of proof. The film's portrayal of ordinary citizens taking personal responsibility for ensuring justice seemed almost fantastical to men accustomed to authoritarian legal structures. Major Thompson's intelligence reports from this period, recently released through the Freedom of Information Act, documented extraordinary changes in prisoner attitudes toward American legal institutions. Men who had arrived at Camp Alva convinced that democratic governance was inherently weak and inefficient were beginning to recognize the moral strength required for societies that protected minority rights and individual liberties. The film's exploration of prejudice and stereotyping created particularly powerful reactions among prisoners who had participated in Nazi racial policies. Sergeant Otto Brennan, a veteran of Kristallnacht, found himself reconsidering actions he had justified as patriotic duty when confronted with the film's message about the dangers of prejudicial thinking. Technical Sergeant Wilhelm Hoffman experienced what camp psychiatrists documented as a breakthrough moment during the film's climactic jury room scene. Hoffman had commanded an execution squad in Poland, carrying out orders without question because he trusted the judgment of superior officers. Watching 12 ordinary American citizens struggle with questions of evidence and reasonable doubt forced Hoffman to confront uncomfortable questions about his own willingness to accept authority without independent moral reasoning. The success of 12 Angry Men prompted camp authorities to organize formal discussion groups following film screenings. These sessions, led by German-speaking American officers, allowed prisoners to explore the democratic principles demonstrated in the films within a structured educational context. Captain Hayes documented remarkable changes in prisoner behavior following these discussion sessions. Men who had maintained strict military hierarchy and Nazi party discipline began participating in democratic decision-making processes for camp activities and prisoner governance. The transformation from authoritarian to democratic thinking was occurring in real time within the camp's social dynamics. However, the philosophical challenges posed by American films also created psychological casualties among the prisoner population. Several former Nazi officials experienced what military psychiatrists classified as identity crises when their fundamental worldviews collapsed under the weight of democratic alternative perspectives. Private Johann Krause, the former Hitler Youth leader, requested transfer to the camp's psychiatric facility after experiencing severe depression following the 12 Angry Men screening. Krause's personal journals, donated to the Holocaust Memorial Museum, revealed his struggle to reconcile his participation in Nazi youth programs with his growing understanding of democratic moral principles. The camp's medical staff reported increasing requests for counseling services as more prisoners grappled with questions of personal responsibility and moral complicity. The Hollywood film program had become an unexpectedly powerful tool for confronting war crimes and encouraging psychological rehabilitation. October 31st, 1944. Halloween night at Camp Alva took on special significance as German prisoners watched The Wizard of Oz for the first time, many experiencing Technicolor cinema as a technological marvel they had never imagined possible. The film's journey from black and white Kansas to the vibrant world of Oz served as a powerful metaphor for the psychological transformation many prisoners were experiencing through their exposure to American popular culture. Sergeant Klaus Müller, now serving as the prisoners' elected representative to camp administration, recognized profound parallels between Dorothy's journey and his own evolving understanding of American society. Like Dorothy, Muller had been transported from a familiar but oppressive environment, Nazi Germany, to a strange new world that challenged everything he thought he knew about reality and moral values. The film's central message, that individuals possess the power to create positive change through courage, compassion, and intelligence, contradicted fundamental Nazi teachings about the necessity of authoritarian leadership and collective obedience. Dorothy's successful challenge to the wizard's false authority resonated powerfully with prisoners who were beginning to question their own acceptance of totalitarian leadership. Private Ernst Weber found himself particularly moved by the film's portrayal of friendship across different backgrounds and species. The alliance between Dorothy, the Scarecrow, Tin Man, and Cowardly Lion demonstrated the possibility of cooperation based on mutual respect rather than hierarchical dominance, a concept that Nazi ideology had systematically discouraged. According to declassified Army intelligence reports from this period, the Halloween screening of The Wizard of Oz marked a turning point in prisoner attitudes toward camp authorities and American society generally. The film's celebration of home and belonging, "There's no place like home," prompted many prisoners to reconsider what constituted a true homeland worth defending. Technical Sergeant Rudolf Zimmermann, experienced what he later described as an epiphany during the film's revelation that the wizard was merely an ordinary man using technology to create an illusion of supreme power. Zimmermann had served in Hitler's personal security detail and had witnessed the carefully orchestrated pageantry designed to maintain the Führer's mystique. The film's message about looking behind the curtain of authority figures resonated with his growing understanding of how totalitarian leaders manipulated public perception. The camp's educational officer, Major Patricia Williams, noted that prisoner discussions following The Wizard of Oz revealed increasingly sophisticated understanding of democratic principles. Men who had arrived at Camp Alva as committed fascists were beginning to articulate complex thoughts about individual liberty, personal responsibility, and the dangers of concentrating political power in single leaders. However, the film also produced unexpected emotional responses among prisoners who recognized uncomfortable parallels to their own situations. The theme of seeking home while being trapped in an unfamiliar world created homesickness and anxiety about post-war repatriation to a Germany that would likely be dramatically different from the country they had left. Captain Hayes reported that several prisoners expressed interest in remaining in America after the war's conclusion, viewing their captivity as an unexpected opportunity to experience democratic society firsthand. These men had been so thoroughly transformed by their exposure to American values that they preferred permanent exile to returning to a defeated and occupied homeland. The success of the film program at Camp Alva had attracted attention from military authorities throughout the prisoner of war system. Representatives from the War Department visited the facility to study Richardson's methods and evaluate the possibility of expanding similar programs to other installations housing German captives. International observers, including representatives from the International Red Cross and neutral nation diplomatic services, documented the remarkable transformation occurring within Camp Alva's prisoner population. These reports would later influence post-war denazification policies and educational strategies for rebuilding German democratic institutions. December 7, 1944. 3 years to the day after Pearl Harbor, German prisoners at Camp Alva watched Casablanca for a second time. But now they viewed Rick Blaine's moral journey through entirely different eyes. Sergeant Klaus Müller, who had been profoundly shaken by his first encounter with Humphrey Bogart's complex character, now saw Rick's transformation from cynical isolationist to committed anti-fascist as a reflection of his own psychological evolution. The impact of 6 months of Hollywood cinema had fundamentally altered the social dynamics within the prisoner community. What had begun as a population of defeated but largely unrepentant Nazi soldiers had evolved into a complex society where democratic principles were increasingly accepted and practiced. Prisoner elections for camp representatives were conducted with secret ballots and genuine debate about policy alternatives. Private Hans Zimmermann, who had arrived at Camp Alva as a committed Hitler Youth member, now served as editor of the camp newspaper, which featured articles critical of totalitarian governance and supportive of democratic reforms. Zimmermann's transformation represented the success of what military historians would later recognize as one of the most effective denazification programs implemented during the war. The second screening of Casablanca served as a measuring device for the prisoner's ideological journey. Men who had initially dismissed the film as enemy propaganda now engaged with its themes of personal sacrifice, moral courage, and resistance to fascism as universal human values, rather than specifically American or anti-German concepts. Lieutenant Colonel Richardson, preparing his final report on the camp's experimental film program, documented remarkable statistical evidence of transformation. Over 70% of prisoners now express support for democratic governance. Nearly 60% requested educational materials about American constitutional law, and more than 40% indicated interest in permanent immigration to the United States. According to War Department archives recently made available through the National Security Archive, the success of Camp Alva's program influenced military planning for post-war occupation and reconstruction. The evidence that popular culture could achieve ideological transformation more effectively than formal political education shaped American cultural policies in occupied Germany and Japan. Technical Sergeant Wilhelm Hoffman, who had commanded an execution squad in Poland, now led camp discussion groups about war crimes and personal responsibility. Hoffman's journey from war criminal to moral educator represented the most dramatic individual transformation documented in military psychological studies from this period. The impact of the Hollywood film program extended beyond individual psychological change to create lasting institutional effects. Many former Camp Alva prisoners would later play significant roles in rebuilding democratic institutions in post-war West Germany, carrying with them lessons learned through American popular culture during their captivity. Private Johann Krause, the former Hitler youth leader who had experienced severe depression during his ideological transformation, emerged from psychiatric treatment as an advocate for democratic education and youth development programs. Krause's personal testimony about the power of cultural exchange would influence Allied policies toward German youth education in the post-war period. As the war in Europe approached its conclusion, Camp Alva had become something unprecedented in military history, a prisoner of war facility that had successfully transformed enemy combatants into advocates for the democratic values they had originally fought to destroy. The success of this transformation through popular entertainment demonstrated the soft power potential of American cultural exports in ways that military strategists were only beginning to understand. The final film screening at Camp Alva took place on May 8, 1945, Victory in Europe Day. Appropriately, the selected film was Frank Capra's Why We Fight series, which had originally been produced to explain American war aims to Allied soldiers. Now German prisoners of war watched these films as preparation for their return to a defeated homeland, where they would help rebuild democratic institutions. The story of German prisoners discovering American values through Hollywood cinema represented more than successful psychological warfare. It demonstrated the possibility of genuine human transformation through exposure to alternative moral and political frameworks. The men who boarded repatriation ships in 1946 carried with them not just memories of American captivity, but fundamental changes in their understanding of justice, individual worth, and democratic governance that would influence German society for generations to come. Historical references drawn from National Archives records, War Department correspondence, and International Red Cross documentation from Camp Alva, Oklahoma, 1944 to 1946,